Chapter 1. The Final Move of Dr. Voss. It began, as the most elegant murders do, beneath a vaulted ceiling in a place of supposed civility. The Octagonal chess tournament had gathered the finest minds in Europe, not in a grand hall of kings or scholars, but in the domed solarium of Château d'Echecs, an ivy-covered estate nestled in the misty Jura mountains of France. The air was heavy with anticipation and the quiet pulse of intellect as 8 grandmasters competed in a round-robin format for prestige, a generous endowment, and the silent promise of immortality in the chess world. The tournament's organizer, Dr. Alois Voss, was a man of some peculiar repute, a Swiss psychiatrist turned chess patron, known equally for his labyrinthine understanding of the human mind and his uncompromising obsession with the purity of competition. Tall, thin, and ascetic, Dr. Voss rarely spoke unless it was to issue a precise correction or an unsettling observation about someone's deeper impulses. His creation, the Octagonal, was his life's final work and his ego's sanctuary. It was on the 3rd evening of the 5-day event that tragedy unfurled itself like a coiled rook springing into the heart of battle. The body was found just after the final match of the day in Dr. Voss's private study adjoining the solarium. The door had been locked from the inside. It was the chambermaid, a young Alsatian girl named Claudine, who first noticed something wrong. She had come to leave a tray of post-match tea, as was custom. When she received no answer to her knock, she tried the handle. Locked. After another minute of anxious knocking, she summoned the head of security, Monsieur Leclerc, who forced the door. Dr. Voss sat slumped in a high-backed leather chair at his mahogany desk. The game board in front of him was not for show. It bore an incomplete game. A white knight lay toppled. His eyes were wide open, mouth parted in a faint, grotesque smile. His pince-nez glasses had fallen askew. By all appearances, he had died alone, peacefully even. But it was the letter opener, sharp, thin, and driven with surgical precision into his neck just beneath the jaw, that dispelled any such illusions. The room had no windows. The sole entrance was locked. There was no apparent sign of struggle, nor fingerprints on the blade. Yet the books beside his desk had been disturbed, hastily, perhaps violently, and one of his volumes on behavioral theory was missing entirely. Even more curious, his pocket watch, a rare Patek Philippe he was known to polish compulsively, had vanished. It was no robbery. The man's cash and documents remained untouched. His precious antique chess set, carved in black obsidian and ivory, was in its case on the shelf, accounted for. The authorities arrived swiftly, led by the provincial commissaire Gérard Lemoine. A practical man with little patience for academic pomp, Lemoine declared the case bizarre but solvable. The suspects were contained, the setting remote, the timetable narrow. "Someone among them is clever, yes," he told his lieutenant, "but even the clever leave footprints. We shall see." The suspects were 8, and yet more than 8. The players themselves were a menagerie of ego and calculation. Madame Élodie Arquette, the reigning French national champion, cold-eyed and elegant, known to drink black coffee and quote Sartre between matches. Grandmaster Sergei Ivanov, a brooding Russian tactician with a history of psychiatric hospitalization. Professor Julian Netherby, a British polymath whose chess style mirrored his lectures, slow, dense, and dazzling. Lucien Moreau, a Swiss prodigy barely 21, who regarded Dr. Voss as a surrogate father. Beatrix Hartmann, a prickly German-American novelist who'd published a memoir about surviving a chess-addicted father. Matteo Silva, the flamboyant Brazilian champion whose charm masked a vicious endgame. Father Anselm, a Belgian monk and former Blitz champion whose vow of silence had been temporarily lifted to allow participation. Dr. René Marceau, a neurologist with icy hands and an unnerving stare, who had debated Dr. Voss publicly on the ethics of mind games. Each of them had been in the solarium just before the body was found. Each had a reason to resent Dr. Voss, his manipulations, his intrusions, his unnerving psychological tests. There were others, too, the staff, the observers, the fiancé of Lucien Moreau, a pianist with a secret, the caretaker who seemed to know more than he said. And hovering above it all, the sense that this crime had been performed, a final move in a long, invisible game. News of the death traveled quickly. By morning, a hush had fallen over the estate. The tournament was suspended. The guests were instructed to remain at Château d'Echecs until further notice. And on the afternoon of that same day, a curious little man in an impeccable grey suit arrived in a perfectly polished black motorcar. He stepped out, adjusted his cuffs, and tapped the snow off his shoes with the handle of his cane. He was short, with an egg-shaped head, neat mustaches curled to sharp perfection, and eyes that missed nothing. "Hercule Poirot," he announced to the waiting commissaire, "is at your service." And so the real game began. Chapter 2. The First Clues. The study smelled faintly of bergamot and paper, both oddly comforting scents were it not for the lifeless figure slumped in the chair. Hercule Poirot stood just inside the threshold, the body of Dr. Voss still untouched, the air unnervingly still. Commissaire Lemoine had wisely preserved the scene. Nothing had been moved, save for the splintered lock forced open by his officer. Poirot adjusted his cuffs and approached slowly. "A death at the desk," he murmured, "as if the work had concluded. Yet the work, I suspect, has only begun." The body bore no struggle, no sign of panic. The expression was nearly serene, but Poirot's eyes fell immediately on the neck, where the sliver of the ornate bronze letter opener still protruded, buried with ruthless precision into the soft space between jaw and ear. It was not a frenzy. It was not a crime of passion. It was surgical. Poirot knelt delicately and examined the angle of the weapon. He did not see it coming, he said softly, or he trusted the one who delivered it. "Locked from the inside," Lemoine added grimly. "Windowless. The only key was in his pocket, yet no weapon on the floor. It was wiped and planted back into the wound. No prints. No rush. It's clever." "Non, commissaire. It is measured," Poirot corrected, his tone thoughtful. "As one lays a bishop in wait. Tell me, who first entered?" "The maid, Claudine, when he failed to respond for tea. She alerted Monsieur Leclerc. They broke the door. The scene was precisely as you see it." Poirot moved to the desk. The chessboard atop it was peculiar, unfolded in mid-play. A white knight lay tipped beside the board, as though abandoned or discarded. He tilted his head. The final move was not made. It was interrupted. "There's no one he was playing with," Lemoine said. "No signs of a second player." Poirot gave a delicate sniff. "On the contrary, mon ami, there was a second player. See? 2 glasses of tea. Both recently touched, one half finished. And the pieces... White side is more aggressive. Voss always played black, no? Yet here he plays the riskier color." Lemoine frowned. "So he wasn't alone?" "No," Poirot said, now scanning the desk drawers. "He was with someone. Someone he trusted enough to lock the door against interruption." Poirot opened the top drawer, slowly and carefully. Inside were pens, spare note cards, a box of chamomile pastilles. The second drawer held stationery, except tucked beneath the paper, Poirot discovered a folded note. The edges were jagged. Torn in haste, he opened it. It read in a tight, spidery hand. "You have gone too far. You know nothing of sacrifice. Burn it or I will." Poirot raised a brow and passed it silently to Lemoine. "Sacrifice," the commissaire muttered, scanning the note. Chess language? Or emotional? Poirot replied. The writer is angry, but restrained. Controlled rage. They use an ultimatum as a warning, not a release. And the letter was hidden, which means Dr. Voss did not burn it. Nor did he confront them. He kept it. Poirot walked to the bookshelf. There was a space, small, conspicuous, where a book had recently been removed. Fine dust trailed the outline. The missing volume? Lemoyne asked. Personality as puzzle, Poirot murmured, reading the label on the neighboring spines. His own monograph. Perhaps annotated. Perhaps dangerous. Taken after the murder? Or during, but yes, most likely after. Either it contained something incriminating, or the killer feared what was written in it. Poirot turned back to the room. His gaze swept across the details. The still burning fireplace, the silver pen uncapped beside the blotter, a single droplet of ink on the corner. A sudden rustle came from the hallway. Footsteps. Poirot turned as a man entered, tall and hollow-eyed, with a sheen of nervous sweat at his temples. I did not mean to intrude, he stammered. Lemoyne stepped forward. You are? Lucien Moreau, Dr. Voss's student, and I suppose his heir, though I knew little of his affairs. I had hoped to collect his chess set, the obsidian one. He promised. Poirot raised a hand. Mademoiselle Claudine informed us you were very close. Lucien swallowed. He was a father to me, in a way. I've played chess with him since I was 12. But I would never... He trailed off, eyes darting toward the body. Poirot studied him. You do not grieve as a son, he said, but as someone frightened. Lucien's jaw tightened. I didn't think this place, this tournament, could ever turn into something so grotesque. On the contrary, Poirot murmured, such places invite precisely the grotesque. The mind engaged in chess is a mind trained to lie. Cleverly, elegantly. The move was masked as sacrifice. The trap dressed as generosity. It is, as Monsieur Voss would say, a test of control. Lucien's eyes darkened. He did say that. He loved control. Poirot looked to the tipped white knight. So did the one who played this game. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. The drawing room of Chateau d'Echec was warmed by a crackling fire, but the chill in the air was unmistakable. 8 minds, each honed by years of calculation and strategy, now found themselves pawns in a real game. One played by death and deciphered by Hercule Poirot. He stood at the head of the room, immaculate in his tailored grey suit, his moustache immovable and his gaze sharper than any chessboard trap. I thank you for your cooperation, he began, folding his gloved hands before him. We are, as you say, en huis clos, in a closed circle. The tragedy has occurred. The killer is among us. So let us lay the board. The suspects, seated in a semicircle of leather armchairs, shifted uneasily. Poirot began with the woman seated closest to the fire, wrapped in a high-collared navy coat, her black hair pulled into a severe bun. Madame Élodie Arquette, he said with a slight bow. You are, by reputation, cold as the alpine winds and twice as precise. Dr. Voss once described your play style as immaculate and without pity. Arquette tilted her head. He said that to you? He often preferred similes involving insects for me. A mantis with a queen's crown, I believe, was one. A thin smile. Poirot moved on. Grandmaster Sergei Ivanov, slouched in his chair with eyes half-lidded. A shaggy beard and a thick woolen coat gave him the air of a weary bear. Dr. Voss arranged your early release from the Zakharov clinic, Poirot said. He believed genius should not be confined, even if it is volatile. Ivanov grunted. I was better at chess than therapy. Voss said madness was useful if managed. He managed me, yes? A long exhale. Poirot turned to the tall, bookish man beside him. Professor Julian Netherby, Cambridge mind, obsessive positional player. You once debated Dr. Voss on stage regarding whether chess revealed personality or concealed it. Netherby polished his glasses. He enjoyed turning humans into hypotheses. I found it distasteful, but I played his game. I always knew he would push it too far. Poirot nodded slowly. Beatrix Hartmann, he said, his tone softening. Novelist, memoirist. Your book, The Bishop's Daughter, was a sensation. You exposed your father's descent into obsession through chess. Dr. Voss wrote the foreword. Beatrix sat rigidly upright, fingers tapping the arm of her chair. He did, and he rewrote it 3 times, manipulating the message until it suited his thesis. We had not spoken in over a year. Poirot did not press. Not yet. Matteo Silva, Poirot said, pivoting to the man sprawled at the end of the room, one leg thrown over the other, an untouched glass of cognac in his hand. Brazilian champion, notorious for improvisation and charm. Dr. Voss once accused you of match-fixing in São Paulo. The accusation was withdrawn. Silva smiled broadly. That's because it was untrue, or because he had no proof. Take your pick. We made peace. Of a kind. Chess is like flirting, no? A glance, a misdirection. A touch of risk. Poirot did not return the smile. Father Anselme. The monk's robe was dark brown, his face serene, hands folded on his lap. The only sound he'd made since entering was a respectful nod. You speak little, Father, but you once played blitz chess in Antwerp with such ferocity the table cracked beneath your strikes. Father Anselme inclined his head solemnly. Dr. Voss insisted that belief and intellect were incompatible, Poirot said gently. He often said that you were his most stubborn experiment. The monk's eyes did not flicker. And then, finally, Dr. René Marceau, tall, angular, with a surgeon's calm and the faint scent of antiseptic clinging to his sleeves. He sat with one leg crossed, chin resting on one hand, eyes fixed on Poirot. You debated Voss for years, in conferences, in journals. You accused him of blurring psychiatry with manipulation. You said once, he does not treat the mind, he sharpens it until it cuts people. Marceau lifted one brow, and I stand by that. Poirot turned toward the final figure, Lucien Moreau, standing near the door like an uneasy shadow. He had not sat. His arms were crossed tightly across his chest. You are his protégé, Poirot said. His heir in research and chess, the closest to him, and perhaps the most wounded by him. Lucien flinched but said nothing. Poirot allowed the silence to build. Each of you had cause to resent the late Dr. Voss, he said, a mind like his cultivated enemies as often as students. And now he lies dead in a locked room, stabbed mid-game while sharing tea with someone he trusted. He stepped toward the chess set displayed in the corner. Dr. Voss's prized obsidian and ivory board. He ran a gloved hand along its glass case. One of you played with him that night, one of you drank from the second cup, and one of you made the final move. The fire popped, and no one spoke. Poirot turned to Lemoine. We begin the interviews now. I wish to speak with Madame Arquette first. And why her? The commissaire asked. Poirot smiled, because she smiles without warmth and speaks without fear. A mind like hers always opens a few moves ahead. Let us see where her board begins. Chapter 4. Initial Interviews. Begin. Madame Élodie Arquette sat across from Poirot in a modest salon with parquet floors and a view of the snow-dusted courtyard. The room, though elegant, was stripped of distraction, no ticking clock, no paintings to catch the eye. Only 2 chairs and a low table with a silver tea set. Poirot, perched with his usual precision, offered her tea. She declined. You dislike small rituals, I think, Poirot said mildly. You prefer structure, chess over conversation. Elodie met his gaze evenly. Conversation is structured, at least when done well. Touché, Poirot murmured. Then let us begin the match, madame. She nodded once. Tell me, Poirot said, your relationship with Dr. Voss, how would you describe it? Mutually transactional, she replied. He wanted a female champion to fit his theory of dispassionate excellence. I wanted his invitation to the Octagon. We used each other, but not fondly. No, fondness clouds judgment. Dr. Voss believed that too. And yet you were once seen as his favored pupil. Until I refused his final condition, she said flatly. Poirot tilted his head. And that was? He wanted me to submit to one of his psychological diagnostics, a series of interviews he recorded. Privately, I declined. Poirot noted this silently. Did he react badly? He said I had just proven his hypothesis, that those who fear exposure hide the most. She leaned back. I told him the same could be said of people who obsess over exposing others. Do you know who agreed to these recordings? She gave a slight shrug. He had his little projects. Lucien, certainly. Perhaps Ivanov. Beatrix, I think. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And the night of his death. I retired to my room early. I do not drink and I do not socialize with people I intend to defeat. Did you speak to him that day? I passed him in the corridor. He looked pleased with himself. Smug. I assumed he had cornered someone. He liked doing that, like a cat with a bird. She looked at Poirot. Are we finished? For now. Next came Sergei Ivanov, his coat draped over his shoulders like a shroud. He sat with his hands folded on his knees, staring past Poirot as if the wall behind him held a hidden board only he could see. Tell me of your last encounter with Dr. Voss, Poirot said gently. Ivanov snorted. Every encounter with Voss was the same. He poked, he tested. Then he smiled when I did not scream. Did you scream often? Once, in Vienna, they restrained me for 3 days. Voss thought it was illuminating. But he brought you here. Because he needed proof that brilliance survives madness. I am his trophy. He called me his Black Knight. Ivanov's lip curled. He thought it flattering. Where were you last night? I played my final match with Father Anselm. Then I drank vodka alone in the observatory. I could not sleep. The stars do not move quickly enough to distract the mind. Poirot leaned forward. Did you see anyone enter Dr. Voss's study? A long pause. No. But I heard a voice. A low one. A man, perhaps. It echoed through the solarium just before midnight. You did not investigate? I had enough ghosts of my own. Julian Netherby entered next, adjusting his waistcoat with fidgety fingers. His pale face gleamed with sweat despite the chill. I'll save you the trouble, Monsieur Poirot, he began. Yes, I argued with Dr. Voss. Repeatedly. I thought his methods were barbaric. And yet you accepted his invitation. I needed the exposure, he said stiffly. And to prove that thoughtfulness, true strategy, still had a place in chess. You were once a friend of his. A rival. He was fascinated with me in Cambridge. He sent me books, annotations, letters. Then I stopped replying. Why? Because he began writing about me. Not to me, as if I were a case study. Poirot nodded slowly. Did you see him last night? No. I returned to my quarters after dinner to review my loss against Arquette. It was humbling. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Do you consider humility a virtue? Netherby blinked. I consider it a weapon. It lulls the opponent. Next came Beatrix Hartmann, entering briskly with a notebook clutched to her chest. I assume you've read The Bishop's Daughter, she asked, her voice tart. I have, Poirot replied. A raw work, introspective, painful. Voss loved it. Said I had mined my trauma with surgical elegance. She sneered. I told him I wasn't a mine, just a person. You were close once? He wanted me to ghostwrite a memoir for him. I declined. Poirot's eyes lit up. Interesting. A man obsessed with his own theories, wishing for someone else's voice. He knew he wasn't likable. He wanted posterity without the mess. Where were you last night? In the library, reading. Then in my room. I didn't sleep much. Why? She looked away. Because I had just discovered he stole part of a manuscript I'd shared with him 2 years ago. A metaphor, word for word, in his new article. Poirot's brow furrowed. Did you confront him? I wrote him a note. Torn from my notebook. A note. She stiffened. Yes. Why? Poirot reached into his pocket and withdrew the torn scrap he had found in the desk. He handed it to her. Her eyes widened. That's... He kept it. Poirot studied her expression. Indeed, mademoiselle, and that, you see, is most curious. Chapter 5. The First False Lead. The next morning, frost clung to the windows of Château d'Échec like spectral fingerprints. The estate remained silent, though not from respect. It was the quiet of tension coiled tight, a waiting room for guilt. In the main lounge, Commissaire Lemoine leaned over a table strewn with papers, visibly satisfied. I believe we may be close, Monsieur Poirot, he said. There is a witness, a young maid, Claudine, claims she saw Dr. René Marceau entering the study corridor late last night, shortly before the estimated time of her death. Poirot sipped his coffee, eyes distant. And what time does she place him there? Around 11:40. Dr. Seuve. Voss was likely killed between 11:30 and midnight. There's no mistake. She was bringing fresh towels to the guest's wing and saw Marceau's silhouette in the hallway mirror as she turned the corner. And where does Dr. Marceau claim to have been? In the music room, apparently, alone, reviewing anatomical sketches. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Alone, always the weakest of alibis. Lemoine gestured broadly. He has no defense, no corroboration, and you saw his attitude yesterday, cool, clinical, as if he were diagnosing a condition rather than mourning a man. Poirot stirred his spoon slowly. Yes. And yet, mon ami, cleverness and coldness are not the same thing as guilt. Still, Lemoine was not wrong in his instincts. Marceau's demeanor had a kind of impersonal chill to it, an intellectual distance even from death. The suspect was summoned to the salon, where Poirot waited with calm patience and Lemoine stood with the restrained posture of a man expecting a confession. Marceau entered, calm as ever. You've summoned me. I assume this is about the corridor? Just so, Poirot said mildly. You were seen near Dr. Voss's study shortly before his death. I was indeed, Marceau replied without hesitation. I went to retrieve a monograph Dr. Voss had borrowed from me, a 1926 volume on neurological modeling. I left a note on his door when he did not answer. Did you enter the study? No, the door was locked. And your note? Lemoine asked. Still there, I imagine. I signed it with my initials, RM, in blue ink. Lemoine dispatched a gendarme to check. Minutes later, the young man returned, holding a small slip of paper torn from a pocket notebook. It read, "Returned for the borrowed volume. Please leave it with the staff. RM." Lemoine frowned. Curious, Poirot said, turning the paper over. And yet you did not mention this in your first interview. I assumed it was unimportant. I did not wish to appear opportunistic, Marceau said, unfazed. I trusted you'd ask if you thought it relevant. Then tell me, Poirot said gently, what was your relationship with Dr. Voss in truth? Marceau folded his arms. Philosophically, we were enemies. He believed in engineering the human mind. I believe in understanding it. He called me primitive. I called him reckless. You debated publicly. Often. He baited me with invitations and insults. And yet, oddly, we understood each other. He allowed a cold smile. Because we were alike in one way, we didn't need to be liked. Poirot leaned forward. You were the last to play him in the tournament. Yes. I lost. Not humiliatingly, but thoroughly. Did he say anything afterward? Only this. If I played you in the mind instead of on the board, I would lose. It was a compliment, though I doubt he meant it. Poirot steepled his fingers. Dr. Marceau, let us consider. You were seen near the study. You had reason to resent the victim. You cannot fully account for your movements. The circumstances do not favor you. Marceau met Poirot's eyes, calm and unflinching. And yet, Monsieur Poirot, you do not believe I am the killer. Poirot smiled faintly. No, monsieur. I do not. Lemoine shifted, startled. But why? Because, Poirot said, rising, you would never have chosen the neck. Lemoine blinked. Pardon? Poirot gestured. You are a neurologist, a surgeon, a master of anatomy. You know every vital point in the body. If you intended a swift, silent kill, you would strike at the carotid or the heart, not a slow puncture below the jaw. Marceau nodded slowly, intrigued. That is true. I would not. Furthermore, Poirot continued, you are methodical. You would never leave the body so poetic. A toppled knight, 2 cups of tea, a missing book. That is the work of someone who wants the murder to feel like an ending. A performance, Marceau said quietly. Exactement. Lemoine frowned. Then the girl saw him near the corridor, yes. But that doesn't mean he entered. Poirot nodded. And that, my friend, is the lesson. In chess, not every piece moved is the one that strikes. Marceau's presence was a shadow, but not the blow. Lemoine sighed. Then back to the board, I suppose. Poirot turned back to the window, where the snow had begun to fall again, softly, steadily. No, he said, not back to the board, to the mind behind it. Chapter 6. The Psychological Game. The wind howled outside Chateau d'Echecs, a muffled, ghostly moan through the stone corridors. But inside, the drawing room had grown very still. Poirot stood in the center, his polished shoes neatly aligned, his gaze dancing from face to face. They had gathered again, 7 grandmasters, 1 chess heir, and a monk who said nothing but whose presence was as unreadable as any puzzle on a board. Forgive me, Poirot began, hands gently clasped, but today I do not ask questions. I play a little game. He gestured to the center of the room, where he had placed Dr. Voss's own chessboard. It had been retrieved from its glass case by special permission of the authorities, and now lay ready, half set, the white pieces arranged in the exact pattern from the incomplete match in his study. The black pieces remained untouched. Let us see, Poirot continued, who among you recognizes the game? Or rather, the strategy. White played aggressively, yes? Knight before bishop. No early castling. And yet, this move. He pointed to the toppled knight, which had once stood at f3. It is not a mistake. It is a sacrifice. The room remained silent, but Poirot's words struck an unseen chord. He looked slowly to Lucien Moreau, who stood near the fire, arms folded tightly. Tell me, mon garçon, would Dr. Voss ever willingly sacrifice a knight so early in the match? Lucien hesitated. Not unless he was testing something, or someone. Indeed, not unless he was playing with the mind rather than the board. Poirot let the silence breathe. Which makes this game not a game at all, but a conversation. A quiet shuffle came from the corner. Beatrix Hartmann had crossed her arms. Her fingers drummed a faint rhythm against her sleeve. Poirot's voice softened. Did you know, mademoiselle, that he kept your letter, the one you wrote in anger? Beatrix's mouth twitched. Yes, you showed it to me. Did you know he had annotated it? That got her attention. She looked up sharply. In pencil, Poirot added, retrieving a small notebook from his pocket. He underlined your phrase, "You have gone too far." Beside it, he wrote, "Excellent. Observe pattern of resistance under emotional pressure." Beatrix's face flushed. He was using me. Poirot did not nod, but his expression was gentle. Did you think he would not? A man like Dr. Voss did not collect opponents. He collected reactions. And you, mademoiselle, you gave him what he wanted. But also, perhaps, more than you meant. She looked away, jaw tight. Poirot turned next to Matteo Silva, who lounged at the piano with one leg hooked over the bench. Matteo, he said lightly, you flirted with the concept of chaos, no? I flirt with many things, monsieur. Oui, but chaos most of all. Your chess games, flamboyant, improvised, unpredictable. Dr. Voss once wrote that your talent masked a fear of being known. Silva chuckled. He wrote a great many things. Did it anger you? Poirot asked softly. To be so publicly dissected? Silva's smile faltered for half a beat. I am used to being misunderstood. Yet I wonder, Poirot said, if perhaps you once allowed him to understand too much, and regretted it. Silva stood suddenly. This is tiresome, Poirot. You prod at us like he did. Perhaps that is your way, but some of us are not as easily pinned as butterflies. On the contrary, Poirot said, unmoved, butterflies, even when pinned, flutter for quite some time. An awkward silence fell. From the far chair, Élodie Arquette finally spoke. What are you hoping to achieve with all this, monsieur? You've said nothing we don't already know. Ah, Poirot said, stepping toward her. But it is not what I say, it is how you respond. The move you see as rarely as revealing as the pause before it. He stopped before the chessboard again. Someone in this room sat across from Voss that night. Someone drank tea with him and played this opening. Someone knew they were going to kill him before the night fell. He tapped the ivory knight gently, and someone, perhaps without meaning to, left behind their strategy, not in the pieces, but in their reaction. Poirot turned back toward the group. There are those who express anger with noise, and those who express it with silence. But the most dangerous of all, he said softly, are those who express it with performance, with precision, with the illusion of calm. His eyes fell on Lucien Moreau once again. You were closest to him, his student, his son in thought, if not in name. Lucien's voice was tight. That's why I couldn't have done it. He was everything to me. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Exactly. Which is why I must ask, what did he take from you that was too much to forgive? Lucien's breath caught, but then he turned away, retreating behind silence. Poirot let him go. For now. Lemoine, watching from the doorway, stepped forward at last. What now? Now, Poirot said, eyes lingering on the board. We wait for the next move. Chapter 7. The Vanishing Manuscript. It was just after 6 in the morning when the first scream echoed through the stone halls of Château de Chex. Poirot, already fully dressed and immersed in a quiet contemplation near his bedroom window, rose swiftly. He moved with purpose through the arched corridor toward the source of the commotion, the long gallery near the study. There, a trembling figure in slippers and robe stood by a broken display case. Lucien Moreau. The manuscript, it's gone, he cried. Dr. Voss's final treatise. It was here. I locked it myself last night. Lemoine appeared moments later, followed by 2 sleepy-eyed staff members and Élodie Arquette, who clutched a shawl to her chest. One look at the shattered glass was enough to banish all fatigue. Mon Dieu, Élodie murmured. That was the only original. Poirot studied the scene quietly. A single sheet of thick paper still clung to the brass clips within the display frame, torn along the edge. He crouched beside the shattered glass. "No sign of force on the lock itself," Lemoine muttered. "Same as the chessboard case in Voss's study." Poirot nodded. Indeed, the thief had knowledge of the chateau's security and its inhabitants. Lucien raked his hand through his hair. "This makes no sense. That manuscript was encrypted in symbols only he and I could read. Why steal something so meaningless to anyone else?" "Ah," Poirot said gently, "but that depends on what one means by meaningless." He turned to the gathering crowd, which now included Matteo Silva, yawning and shirtless under his blazer, and Beatrix Hartmann, her face pale and unreadable. "The theft occurred between 3 and 6 this morning," Poirot said. "That we can be certain of. Inspector Lemoine passed this hallway at 3 on his final patrol." Lemoine gave a small nod. "Routine walk. Case was untouched then." Poirot motioned toward the broken display. The glass was shattered outward, not inward. A moment of frustration, perhaps, or a staged break-in after the manuscript had already been removed. Elodie narrowed her eyes. "Are you suggesting one of us took it?" Poirot made no accusations. "I suggest only that the thief did not come from outside, and I ask this. Why take the manuscript now, after Dr. Voss is already dead?" Beatrix spoke quietly. "To hide something? Something in the manuscript that points to the killer." Lucien looked at her, eyes bloodshot. "Or someone wants to rewrite it." A silence settled over them. Silva cleared his throat. "Let's suppose," he said, lounging on the windowsill, "someone close to Voss had something to lose. The manuscript, I hear, was his grand final philosophy, oui? What if it said something ugly?" Beatrix's gaze flicked toward him. "Like what?" Silva shrugged. "Maybe Voss suspected someone of plotting. Maybe he recorded that. Maybe someone couldn't risk it being seen." Poirot's mind turned over the theory. In chess, destruction was rarely random, it was sacrifice. Pieces were lost to gain something larger. He stood slowly, motioning to Lemoine. "Inspector, I believe it is time we conduct a search of the guests' rooms. Quietly, discreetly." Lemoine raised an eyebrow but nodded. "I'll handle it." Poirot turned next to the group. "And while we wait, I ask only one thing. Reflect not on what has been taken, but why it needed to be erased. Something in that manuscript frightened someone. A truth, a name, a memory." He let the weight of that idea settle. "Fear," he added softly, "often leads to desperate moves." It was just before breakfast when Lemoine returned, lips tight, carrying a slim leather folder in one hand. "I found it," he said, "hidden behind the wardrobe in the monk's chamber." Gasps rippled through the group. "The monk?" Elodie whispered. "But he barely speaks." They all turned as Brother Calixte was escorted forward, his face serene. He said nothing, only bowed his head. Poirot stepped toward him. "Brother, may I ask, why take the manuscript?" The monk's lips parted, voice low and reverent. "Because he told me to." "Dr. Voss?" Poirot asked, eyebrows rising. Calixte nodded. "Before the tournament, he came to me in confession. He said he was being followed, that something was coming for him. He feared his words might be used against someone he once cared for." "Who?" Poirot asked. Calixte's gaze lifted, and to everyone's shock, his eyes found Lucien Moreau. "He said, if anything happened to him, I was to retrieve the manuscript and burn it." Lucien's face twisted. He wouldn't say that. He trusted me." Calixte didn't flinch. "He loved you, but he feared what you had become." The silence that followed was deafening. Poirot held up a hand. "No one is accused. Not yet. But I will need to study that manuscript, every page. Lemoine handed it over. The leather was cracked, the parchment inside filled with precise symbols, dense patterns of logic and insight, a mind laid bare. Poirot's fingers tightened slightly. He would not burn it. He would read it. And in its final passages, he hoped, Dr. Voss had left not just a theory, but a confession. Chapter 8. The Codex of Intent. The morning fog had not yet lifted from the chateau's ancient towers, and stillness reigned across its ivy-clad walls. Inside the drawing-room, however, the atmosphere was taut with suppressed tension. The fire crackled low as Poirot settled himself beside a long oak table, the manuscript before him like a puzzle box from antiquity. Opposite him sat Élodie Arquette, her fingers already dusted with graphite and ink. She had fetched her grandfather's old ciphering tools, graph paper, symbol dictionaries, and a hand-rolled magnifier, and her quiet energy crackled with nervous anticipation. "The language is not truly encrypted," she explained, eyes scanning the dense, looping script. "It's a symbolic dialect, chess notation merged with philosophical shorthand. Dr. Voss used it only in his private meditations." Poirot murmured, "A code only meant to be understood by himself, or by someone who shared his mind." Élodie nodded slowly. Lucien. He'd taught him the cipher, but Dr. Voss used flourishes even Lucien found difficult. This goes deeper. They worked in silence for a time, the morning sun filtering across the table. The manuscript revealed itself not in chapters, but in layers, spirals of reflection, logic, grief. Voss's treatise was more than academic. It was intimate, a psychological game of self-dissection. Poirot flipped to a central folio. A phrase, half legible, caught his attention. "There are no traitors in the endgame, only pieces displaced from purpose." He traced it with his finger. Below it, a date, 2 weeks before the tournament. "Here," Poirot said. He references a final gambit and writes of the necessity of the octagon. Élodie leaned closer. He always believed the octagonal format allowed a complete psychological exposure of players. He used to say, "In such a structure, you cannot hide behind drawers. You must reveal the soul in every move." Poirot's eyes sharpened. And if someone feared that exposure, he might have tried to silence the game. They turned the page. A diagram appeared next, an octagonal map with initials drawn around the perimeter. Voss had sketched not just the pairings but emotional ties, arrows between Lucien and Beatrix, Beatrix and Silva, Silva and Élodie. Even Lemoine's name sat at one edge. Poirot studied the lines. "It is not just a tournament," he said softly. "It is a confession booth." He arranged these players not by rank, but by intimacy. Élodie glanced at him. "You think this was more than sport?" "I think it was his final experiment, a psychological trap, one he did not expect to escape alive." Later that afternoon, Poirot called for Inspector Lemoine and requested quiet interviews with each guest. They met in the sunroom, where glass panes overlooked the chess garden now abandoned in fog. Beatrix Hartmann arrived first. "You knew him longest," Poirot began. "What did he fear most in his final weeks?" Beatrix hesitated. "Being misunderstood, being misrepresented. Voss was obsessed with legacy." "And did he confide anything about the manuscript?" She shook her head. "He mentioned writing it. Said it would be his way of clarifying his views on competition, deception, and love. But he didn't share details." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And the night he died, what time did you retire?" Beatrix's lips tightened. "Around midnight. I couldn't sleep, though. I walked the halls for hours." "Did you see anyone else?" She hesitated. "Yes. Matteo, near the library. He said he was getting a drink." Poirot made a note. Next came Silva, who arrived barefoot and unapologetic. "You ask about the dead man's secrets," he said with a grin. "But have you considered his lies?" "Explain, Monsieur Silva." "He believed he could shape people like pawns. He wanted reactions, rage, grief, betrayal. He pushed us, all of us." Poirot nodded. "Did he push you too?" A flicker of something crossed Silva's eyes. "He asked me to lose the second match, said it would realign the octagon." I refused. Poirot arched his brow. "That is not the kind of request one makes without purpose." "No," Silva said, standing. "It isn't." By dusk, Poirot returned to the manuscript, alone now. He flipped once more to the octagonal map and pressed gently on the paper's edge. To his surprise, the page bent unnaturally. Carefully, he peeled the layer back. A second sheet had been hidden beneath it. On it was a single chess puzzle, an unfinished position in the center of the board. Below it, a line. "One piece controls the fate of kings, but it does not know its name." Poirot sat back. He had seen this puzzle before. Not in a book, not on a board, but in the central match of the tournament, Lucien versus Beatrix. A position Voss had praised as the embodiment of risk, and now it was the clue. A metaphor, a declaration. One player had made a move that sealed another's fate. But which piece? Which player? He gazed again at the diagram. "The pawn," he whispered, "the one who believed they were small but shifted the entire game." He closed the manuscript gently, a sense of direction emerging from the fog. The truth, like the puzzle, was nearly complete, but it required one final move. Chapter 9. A Pawn Among Queens. The rain fell softly on the stained glass windows of the chateau, like a whisper against memory. Poirot, impeccably dressed in his storm-grey suit, stood before the tall arched pane in the west corridor, watching the storm mist blur the outline of the garden's chess pieces below. It was almost poetic how the final game of Dr. Voss's life now reflected the very weather, murky, shifting, deceptive. He turned as Élodie stepped lightly into the hallway. "I received word you wished to speak with me, Monsieur Poirot." "Oui, mademoiselle." "Walk with me." They strolled slowly toward the library, the walls lined with oil portraits of past chess grandmasters, men and women whose brows bore the eternal tension of strategy. Poirot gestured to a familiar face on the wall. "Do you recognize her?" Élodie nodded. "Beatrix Hartmann at her championship in Geneva. 2007. She defeated Lucien in the final match." Poirot gave a slight smile. "You recall it well." "I was a child, but I remember how angry Lucien became. He left the tournament in silence. Dr. Voss was furious at him for breaking composure." Poirot stopped walking. "Did you know, mademoiselle, that Voss had instructed Lucien to throw that final match?" Élodie blinked. "No, Why would he do that?" "Because he believed Beatrix's victory would catalyze her transformation. He believed certain minds matured only through triumph or through regret." She folded her arms. "That sounds like him." Poirot turned to her fully. "Did you know Beatrix was not his only experiment?" A long silence stretched between them. The flicker of hurt was faint but visible in Élodie's eyes. "He raised me like a daughter," she said at last. "But yes, I knew. I always knew I was part of some chessboard of the soul. He placed us all like pieces, hoping we'd crash into each other in meaningful ways." "You played in the octagon for the first time," Poirot noted. "Why now?" "I didn't want to, but he insisted, said it would close a loop." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Did he ever mention the Geneva tournament again?" "Not often, only that something was left unresolved." Poirot's voice lowered. "He left a position in his final manuscript, a puzzle based on that Geneva match. But there was one difference. In his recreation, the pawn advances to the queen's 7th rank and stalls. Elodie's breath caught. A pawn that refuses to promote? Or cannot, Poirot said, stepping closer, because it doesn't know it is worthy. She stared at him, and Poirot saw in her a sudden flash of realization, of something unspoken coming into clarity. "Did he write my name in that position?" she asked. "No," Poirot answered softly, "but he drew your father's." Poirot next sought Beatrix Hartmann, who stood by the long window in the conservatory, holding a cigarette she hadn't lit. "Do you know the worst part of playing someone like Voss?" she said before Poirot could speak. "It's that no matter how brilliant you are, you always suspect he's letting you win." Poirot gave a quiet nod. Geneva must have left a deep scar. Beatrix's jaw tightened. That match was the pinnacle of my career. But after that, he withdrew. Coldly, it was as if I had only done what he expected. Poirot walked to her side. "You knew about Lucien's instructions?" She turned to him, eyes sharp. "Eventually. I confronted Voss years later. He admitted it, smiling as though proud of me for figuring it out." Poirot remained quiet for a moment. "Why come to the Octagon now, after so long?" "Closure," she replied, "and maybe a little revenge. I wanted him to watch me win again. Fair and square." Poirot examined her. "But you didn't win, did you?" Beatrix said nothing. "The pawn in his final puzzle," Poirot murmured, "cannot ascend because someone else has already decided its fate. Someone who pretends to liberate, but truly controls." Beatrix turned fully toward him. "Are you accusing me, monsieur?" "I accuse no one. I only observe." He smiled gently. "But the manuscript, someone tampered with it after his death. Not to erase guilt, but to obscure a revelation. A truth Dr. Voss intended to leave behind." He held her gaze a moment longer before bowing slightly and departing. That evening, Poirot returned to the chess garden alone, his overcoat pulled tightly against the wind. The great marble board stood silent, the raindrops glistening atop the polished black and white squares. He moved to the center, kneeling beside a particular square. Queen's 7th rank. The pawn piece, smaller than the others, with a barely visible engraving, had shifted since the morning storm. Poirot turned it gently. There, etched faintly into its base, were the initials E.V. Elodie Voss. Poirot stood slowly, hands behind his back. She was the key, not just to the game, but to the life Voss had never fully explained. Not a student, not merely a daughter. But something else, perhaps even the true heir to his vision. She had not known it, not fully, but someone else had, and that someone had killed to ensure the secret never reached the final rank. Chapter 10. The Queen's Shadow. Midnight fell like a veil over the Château de Roquebrune, and the storm relented just enough for the corridors to breathe. Poirot, freshly shaven and neatly dressed in his evening attire, stood at the head of the grand hall, where a fire now crackled against the chilled air. One by one the guests filed in, summoned not by curiosity, but a quiet command from Poirot that none had dared to decline. Elodie arrived first, eyes wary, then Beatrix, her posture upright and defensive. Lucien followed, a silk scarf around his neck and a flicker of disdain in his glance. After him came the others. Dieter, Rosa, Mikhail, Helena, all settling into the high-backed chairs placed in a deliberate semicircle around the fireplace. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of the long case clock that marked each moment with the gravity of a chess timer. Poirot stood before them, his hands folded behind his back. "Mes amis," he began, "thank you for indulging me once more. We are nearing the end of our game." A flicker of movement from Lucien, who smirked faintly. Poirot caught it, then continued. I've come to understand that this tournament, this octagonal, is more than a match of intellect. It is the final statement of a man who manipulated brilliance and weakness with equal skill. Dr. Voss was not merely a mentor. He was a composer of fates, and one of you altered his final composition. A stillness fell over the room. There was a moment, Poirot went on, in the reconstruction of the Geneva match where a single deviation occurred, a pawn that advanced to the 7th rank, and waited. It did not promote. He turned to Elodie. That pawn was you, mademoiselle. Elodie's breath caught audibly. Her hands clutched the arms of the chair. He left behind a cipher, Poirot explained, within the manuscript, a game notation that was both a puzzle and a confession. The position corresponds not only to Geneva, but to a decision Voss made years ago, an act he concealed until now. Beatrix's voice cut in, sharp. What act? Poirot turned to her. That is what I intend to reveal tonight. But first, let me ask, who tampered with the manuscript? Beatrix's jaw tensed. Lucien leaned forward. Are you suggesting one of us stole pages from it? He asked, incredulous. No, Poirot replied. Not stolen, altered. Someone removed a section and replaced it with a variation, one that obscured Voss's final message. Rosa, quiet until now, whispered, Why would anyone do that? Poirot paused, his voice softening. Because that person feared what the final message might expose. Helena stirred. You're speaking in riddles, Poirot. What was Voss hiding? Poirot met her eyes. A truth he carried for 2 decades. In Geneva, when Lucien was instructed to throw the match, he obeyed. But what was less known, what was never revealed, is that Lucien was not the only player Voss controlled that year. He turned to Beatrix, who now stared at him, frozen. Beatrix Hartmann, he said gently, you did not win the match in Geneva. It was rigged, but not in your favor. You were the sacrifice. The loss Voss believed would awaken your fury and ambition. She stood abruptly. That's a lie. It is not, Poirot said calmly. Voss arranged for both of you to lose something in that match. Lucien, his pride, you, your innocence. It was a psychological experiment, one that backfired. Lucien looked between them, confused. I thought. I was the only one who knew. Poirot nodded. Voss confided in no one. He kept the truth locked in his manuscript. And when he finally tried to reveal it, to let the pieces fall into place, someone stopped him. The fire snapped loudly in the hearth. Poirot moved to the mantel, lifting a sealed envelope. This was found tucked behind the Queen's piece in the garden chessboard, he said. It is Voss's original ending, the real message. He turned the envelope and displayed the initials. E.V. Poirot addressed Elodie now, his voice gentle. Your father did not want to destroy you. He wanted to elevate you, to free you from the legacy of his manipulations. That is why he finally chose to name you, not as a piece, but as the rightful player. Elodie's hands trembled in her lap. But, Poirot continued, someone feared that if this truth emerged, it would unravel everything they believed about their own triumph. He looked again at Beatrix. You returned not for closure, but to confirm your version of history. And when you saw the original manuscript, you knew. You saw that you were never truly the queen of the board, so you removed the truth, replacing it with a variation that kept your illusion intact. Beatrix said nothing. Her silence was thunder. You killed him, Elodie whispered. Didn't you? Beatrix's eyes filled, not with guilt, but fury. He toyed with me, with all of us. Do you know what it's like to build a career on a lie? He made us believe we were playing for glory, but we were always just parts of his experiment. I wasn't going to let him rewrite my story with one dying breath. Poirot stepped forward. But in doing so, you only confirmed the thing he tried to correct. You remained a piece, not a player. Beatrix's shoulders sagged. She looked to Lucian, then to the others, all staring in silent shock. "He asked me to meet him in the library," she said at last. "Said he had something to give me. I confronted him, and he laughed. That laugh, I lost control." Elodie rose slowly, tears forming. "He wanted you to forgive him." Beatrix turned away, unable to speak. Poirot folded the letter back into its envelope. "Tomorrow, the authorities will arrive. But for now, the final move has been made." Chapter 11. Checkmate at Dawn. The morning came quietly to Château de Roquebrune. Light crept over the distant Alps, spreading pink and amber hues across the estate's frost-bitten rooftops. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the ground soaked and silvered. Mist still clung to the hedges of the stone garden, where a giant marble chessboard lay glistening with dew. Inside, the castle had stilled into a hush. Servants moved softly, lighting fires, laying out breakfast trays no one touched. A heavy silence lingered in every hall, as though the chateau itself now bore the weight of the confession made just hours before. Poirot sat in the breakfast room, a porcelain cup of coffee untouched before him. He looked not at the food, nor at the flames, but out through the wide window, toward the garden where the queen piece still stood at the center of the board. He had spent many mornings in silence before a case closed, mornings when justice was done and yet no satisfaction followed. This, he thought, was one of those mornings. Footsteps approached. Elodie entered, her face pale but composed, her arms wrapped in a thick cream shawl. She did not speak at first, merely sat across from Poirot and poured herself a cup of tea. "You didn't sleep," she finally said. Poirot shook his head gently. "No, mademoiselle." "And you?" "I tried, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw him again, that last moment, when I left the library. I keep thinking, what if I hadn't stormed out?" Poirot leaned forward slightly. "You are not responsible for what followed. You were hurt. Rightly so." She looked at him with tired eyes. "I was cruel." "You were honest, and he knew what he risked by revealing the truth." Elodie glanced toward the window. "The others are packing. Most won't even look at me. I think they blame me." "No," Poirot said softly. "They blame themselves. Each carries guilt, even if not one of murder. The truth revealed their own hypocrisies, their envy, their pettiness." She didn't respond, only sipped her tea. Poirot watched her for a moment. Then, "May I ask what you plan to do now?" She didn't answer right away. Then, "There's nothing left for me in Geneva. I don't think I want to return." "You could leave chess behind," he said carefully. Her eyes met his. "Could you?" He smiled, faintly. "Touché?" They sat in silence. A faint clatter sounded outside the breakfast room, Beatrix being led away by the local gendarmerie. Poirot did not rise to watch. Neither did Elodie. "I read the letter," she said at last. "The one you found behind the queen. And," she blinked slowly, "it was the first time he said he was proud of me. Not for winning, not for playing, but for surviving him." Poirot's brow creased slightly. "He wished to unburden you. That was his final move, his checkmate." Elodie smiled faintly. "Then perhaps I should accept it." Poirot nodded. "Sometimes to win, one must step away from the board." They sat quietly for some time. Outside, the first sunlight touched the marble queen, making it shimmer as though it wept. After a while, Poirot stood. "Will you join me for a walk in the garden? There is something poetic about standing once more upon that oversized board. One last game, without pieces." She rose. "I'd like that." They walked in silence down the long corridor, past the library, past the parlor where 8 names had once been inscribed on a gilded roster, the Octagonal tournament, now defunct. Its legacy is forever altered. The garden greeted them with the smell of damp pine and frost. The stone path wound them around mossy columns and dormant roses until they reached the chessboard. They stepped onto the black and white tiles, walking the grid as if retracing old lines of fate. Poirot paused at the center. "The Queen stood here," he said. Elodie nodded. "She always does. She defends, attacks, and sacrifices." Poirot studied her face. "Your father chose this place for a reason. He knew the game began and ended with her. I think he wanted me to see that being a queen is not about winning. It's about bearing the board's weight with grace." Poirot tilted his head. He would be proud. "Now, mademoiselle, what next?" Elodie looked up at the snow-covered peaks. The sun was rising fully now, touching the highest towers of the chateau. "I don't know," she admitted. "But maybe I'll write. Tell the truth. Not just about him, about all of us. The real tournament, the pain, the brilliance, the lies." Poirot's eyes brightened. A memoir, perhaps. She smiled. A reckoning. They stood together a moment longer, side by side, watching the light crawl across the empty board. The pieces were gone. The players scattered, but the game, in its strange, tragic beauty, had been played to its conclusion. Poirot tipped his hat to the marble queen, then to Elodie. "It is done." Elodie nodded. "Yes, checkmate." And with that, they walked off the board, the game behind them, and the truth ahead. Chapter 12. The Eighth Move. It was several days later when Hercule Poirot departed the Château de Roquebrune, his bags neatly packed, his cane precisely angled beside his foot, as he sat once more in the velvet-cushioned train compartment. Outside the window, the French countryside blurred in fields of dull green and fogged valleys, the mountains receding behind him like the pieces of a completed puzzle. Set aside, finished, and yet lingering in the mind. The Octagonal tournament was no more. Its name, once whispered among the elite circles of European chess, would now be spoken of with a different hush, one tinged with scandal and sorrow. A genius unmasked, a father undone, a daughter left to rebuild herself not through victories over the board, but by rising from its wreckage. Poirot leaned back, the train humming beneath him like the low chords of a forgotten symphony. He opened a small notebook, a habit of his, to reflect not just on the facts of the case, but on its echoes. 8 players, 8 personalities, 8 masks, and behind it all, one man playing his final game, not to win, but to destroy his own myth. He drew a line across the page. Truth, when buried too long, emerges not as clarity, but as combustion. He paused. In his many years of investigations, Poirot had encountered cruelty, cunning, even brilliance twisted toward vanity. But Grand Master Adrien Dubois had embodied a rarer category. A man who weaponized his own downfall. His confession was not a surrender. It was a design. He had rigged his own checkmate. The door of the compartment slid open softly. Inspector Martel stepped in, brushing snow from his shoulders. The 2 men greeted each other with a quiet nod, as though their shared knowledge required no formalities. "I took your advice," Martel said, settling into the seat opposite Poirot. "We combed through Beatrix's communications. She had threatened to expose Dubois long before the tournament. She had emails, blackmail essentially. When he cut her from his inner circle, she retaliated. The threat hung over him like a guillotine." Poirot nodded, and Adrien Dubois, being the man he was, could not suffer to be exposed by anyone but himself. Martel sighed. Still, poisoning the tea meant for Beatrix? It's poetic, but it's madness. Poirot tilted his head slightly. "No, my friend. It was symmetrical. A final maneuver, knowing Beatrix might take Elodie's cup by accident. A risk, but one that suited his sense of balance. Martel furrowed his brow. You mean he meant to poison his own daughter? Poirot closed the notebook softly. I mean, he knew the game would not conclude unless a piece fell. Beatrix was reckless. She boasted. She bluffed. He set the board knowing either she or Elodie might fall. In either case, the truth would unravel. The inspector shook his head. It's monstrous. Poirot sighed. Genius and monstrosity, they are not always so far apart. They sat in silence for a moment, the train rounding a curve, trees racing past the window. Do you believe she'll be all right? Martel asked. Elodie? Poirot glanced out at the grey sky. Yes, in time. She's no longer chasing the shadow of her father. She walks in the open air now. The path is hers. Martel leaned back. And the others? Kasparov, Benedek, Fung, the young Spanish boy? Shaken, ashamed. But better for it, perhaps. Poirot gave a small shrug. They came for victory. They left with perspective. Sometimes that is the more lasting prize. A pause. Then Poirot added, even the greatest players forget that the Queen, for all her power, is not immortal. Martel cracked a faint smile. You always speak in riddles, Poirot. I speak in metaphors, he corrected. Riddles leave no clarity. Metaphors invite reflection. They both chuckled softly. Then Martel stood. I disembark at Avignon, he said. There's a case, less poetic, I imagine. A banker, a ledger, and a missing mistress. Poirot bowed his head slightly. Bon courage. As Martel slid the door closed behind him, Poirot allowed the smile to fade from his lips. He looked once more at his notebook. A final entry. The eighth move was not on the board. It was made when Adrien Dubois stopped playing. That, in the end, was his last lesson. Poirot shut the notebook, set it on the table beside him, and folded his hands. The countryside unfurled like a map below the mountain sky, and he, the observer, the detective, the last quiet piece, rode on. Chapter 13. The Quiet Aftermath. Snow was still falling lightly over the sleepy rooftops of Geneva when Hercule Poirot sat by the fireplace of a modest guest-house, far removed from the grandeur of Château de Roquebrune. He had exchanged the marble corridors and mahogany panels of the Dubois estate for this quiet inn by the lake, whose grey waters stretched endlessly into the haze of late winter. The case was officially closed. The media had its headlines. The Grandmaster's Gambit, they called it, and the scandal had already begun its cycle of speculation and scandalized whispers. But Poirot's mind lingered not on the headlines. It lingered on the silence left behind. He sat with a writing desk before him, a fountain pen in hand, composing a letter with his usual care. My dear Hastings, I write to you not from some thrilling crime scene, nor from a drawing room packed with suspects, but from the shore of Lake Geneva, where the air is clean and the world feels, for once, sufficiently slow. The affair of the Octagonal chess tournament has concluded. It was not a case of simple murder, nor of theft or passion. It was something colder. A man who lost his place in the world and chose to leave behind a final riddle disguised as brilliance. Poirot paused. The pen hovered. You see, Hastings, Adrien Dubois did not kill out of rage, nor jealousy. He killed because his myth could no longer sustain the truth. His daughter, Elodie, was always the more gifted, but his pride could not allow her to surpass him openly. When his secrets began to fray, when his mentorship of Beatrix became brittle and bitter, he saw the end approaching. And so, he shaped it. He poisoned the tea, knowing someone else might drink it. He unleashed the chaos with precise intent, as one would a final gambit on the board. Poirot set the pen down and looked at the letter. He had not yet sealed it. There was more to write, more to ponder. The fireplace crackled softly in the room, casting amber light on the quiet detective's shoes, neatly aligned. A knock came at the door. "Entrez," Poirot said without rising. It was Elodie Dubois. She stepped into the room with an elegance that was no longer rehearsed. Gone were the long raven-black gowns and the forced, austere posture. In their place was a simple navy coat, a scarf knotted at her throat, her hair down. "I heard you were still in Geneva," she said gently. "I hoped you would be." Poirot stood and gestured for her to sit. "Mademoiselle Dubois, you are most welcome." She sat across from him, warming her hands near the fire. Her eyes were tired, but no longer veiled by fear. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "Not for solving the case, but for giving me the truth in a way I could hold." Poirot inclined his head. She looked into the flames. "I stayed in Roquebrune a day longer, packed the last of my things. The estate is going up for sale." "You are not staying?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "It was never really mine. It was a museum built around a man who died long before his last match. I think he only kept breathing to prove the myth wasn't over." There was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet understanding that comes after grief has burned itself down to embers. "I'm going to Zurich," she continued. "There's a conservatory there. Not for chess, music. I used to play piano." Poirot's brow lifted with the faintest smile. "You surprised me, mademoiselle." She gave a small laugh. "That's the point, Monsieur Poirot. I want to live a life where I surprise myself." He nodded with warm approval. "That, I think, is the greatest checkmate you could ever deliver to your father's ghost." She stood after a moment. "This may sound strange, but I think he loved me in the only way he could, by trying to stop me." Poirot's voice was low. "Some men express love through possession, others through liberation. Your father..." He wavered between the two. She met his eyes, firm now, no longer searching. "Goodbye, Monsieur Poirot." "Au revoir, Mademoiselle Dubois. May your next game be one of joy." She left with the sound of snow crunching beneath her boots. Poirot watched her vanish into the morning mist. He returned to his letter. "There is a moment, Hastings, after a match ends, when both players sit quietly before the board. The pieces no longer move. The crowd disperses. But between the players, something lingers, a silence full of lessons. That is where I now reside, in the aftermath, watching the board and remembering what each piece cost." He sealed the letter. Then, like a man who had finally completed a long and quiet match of his own, Poirot rose, adjusted his tie with the most impeccable precision, and stepped into the day. Chapter 14. The Final Position. It was 2 weeks later when the curious envelope arrived. Poirot had returned to London, where the rhythms of city life, taxi horns, hurried footsteps, distant clock chimes, played their endless refrain beneath his modest apartment windows on Charterhouse Street. Spring was beginning its gentle campaign against winter's grip, but the detective remained in his usual state of deliberate calm, attuned more to the silent logic of puzzles than the turning of seasons. The envelope was unmarked, save for a single detail, a red wax seal imprinted with the unmistakable outline of a knight chess piece. There was no return address, no name. Just Poirot's own, printed in a clean, minimalist hand. Monsieur Hercule Poirot. He sliced the wax seal carefully with his letter opener and removed a single card. On it was a hand-drawn chessboard. At first glance, it appeared innocuous, a classic endgame position, but Poirot's eyes sharpened at once. The board was arranged in a variation of the King's Indian defense, but with a curious twist. The black bishop was positioned where none ought to be in such a late stage. It was clearly an intentional irregularity, and the white queen, though dominant, was precariously exposed. There were only 5 pieces remaining: white king on g1, white queen on f7, black king on h8, black bishop on c6, and a black pawn on e3. Beneath the drawing was a single line of French. The king retreats, but the queen knows why. Poirot read it twice. A flicker of interest ignited in his eyes. Not quite alarm, but certainly attention. He placed the postcard gently on the side table and sat back. This was not random. It was a message, and more than that, a continuation. Someone had watched the conclusion of the Roquebrune affair and decided the board was not, in fact, cleared. Had Adrien Dubois left behind an acolyte, a final match unfinished, a secret embedded deeper than the crime itself? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of the doorbell. He rose and opened the door to find Miss Felicity Grey, formerly Elodie's confidant and assistant during the tournament, standing with a light raincoat draped over one arm and a pair of anxious eyes. "Miss Grey," Poirot said with polite surprise, "you look as though you have just stepped off a chessboard yourself." She entered quickly, barely waiting for the invitation. "Monsieur Poirot, I hope I'm not intruding, but I've received something strange." She reached into her satchel and withdrew a postcard nearly identical to the one Poirot had received. Her version, however, depicted a different chess position. 6 pieces this time. The white queen had been removed entirely. A white bishop now replaced it, tucked defensively on g2. Black's pawn had advanced. "Same seal?" Poirot asked. She nodded. "Red knight. No return address." "Just my name in London." Poirot took both postcards and placed them side by side. "This is not merely the work of a cryptic admirer," he murmured. "This is a cipher." Felicity's brow furrowed. "But a cipher for what? There's no message, no sender, just these boards." Poirot looked to the fire, his eyes narrowing. Adrien Dubois was a man of legacy, Mademoiselle Grey. He built his image with meticulous calculation, on and off the board. He left a world of symbols behind, and someone, it seems, is determined to make sure we don't close the book too quickly. "Do you think it's Elodie?" she asked, trying to send some kind of final note. Poirot shook his head slowly. "No. Mademoiselle Dubois has made peace with silence. This," he tapped the card, "is noise disguised as a riddle. Someone is still playing." "Not just on a board." Felicity sank into a chair. "What do we do?" Poirot returned to his desk. "We observe. We wait. If they have sent 2, there will be more. And if they don't send more, then we must treat these as the opening moves of a new game, and you, mademoiselle, may find yourself no longer a spectator, but a piece." She paled slightly. "I didn't ask to be part of this." Poirot offered a gentle, almost fatherly smile. "No one ever asks. The board chooses its players." He offered her tea, which she accepted with shaking hands. As the kettle whistled in the background, Poirot sat with the 2 cards laid before him. A soft rain had begun to tap against the windows, like the clicking of a chess clock counting down. Another game had begun. The final position, it seemed, was yet to be played. Chapter 15. The Pawns Advance. The rain had not let up by morning. London wore it like a veil, soft, grey and indefinite. Streets glistened with wet reflections, umbrellas jostled like petals in a storm, and Hercule Poirot, umbrella tucked neatly under one arm, walked with precise care across the cobbled courtyard toward Café Etude. It was his habit, since returning from Roquebrune, to take his breakfast at the quiet establishment tucked just off Museum Street, not because the croissants were particularly excellent, though they were, but because the back corner by the window afforded him a view of both the chessboards and the doors. That morning, however, the usual order was subtly disturbed. Madame Dubois, the proprietress, not to be confused with the late Adrien Dubois, greeted him not with her usual smile, but with a wrinkled brow. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, almost in a whisper, "there is something odd. It was left on your table before you arrived." He raised an eyebrow. Indeed. May I? She gestured toward him. Waiting at his usual table was a chessboard. Not the usual marble one provided by the cafe, but a travel board of polished wood. Set and ready. 6 pieces on it, a white king on e1, a white rook on e4, a black knight on d6, a black pawn on f3, a white pawn on h5, and, oddly, one square left empty but marked with a white queen symbol sketched in chalk. Beside it lay a note, typed this time. Your next move must be precise. The queen's ghost is watching. Poirot folded the note and slipped it into his coat pocket. A waiter hovered nearby, uncertain. Has anyone been seated here this morning? Poirot asked. The man shook his head. Not since we opened. The board was here when I arrived. I assumed you'd brought it. Madame Dubois stepped closer. There was something else, she said quietly. A man. Last night. He asked what time you usually come in. I didn't recognize him. French accent, mid-30s perhaps. Not someone I've seen before. Poirot smiled faintly, though his eyes stayed sharp. Merci, madame. That is most helpful. He sat down and studied the board. A new game, or a continuation? He didn't yet know, but the move was clear. White rook to e6, cutting off the knight and preparing a feint for the queen's ghost to checkmate in 2. It wasn't chess strategy anymore, it was symbolic. Someone was inviting him deeper, and whoever they were, they understood one thing very well. The real game was not played on boards, but in the movement of ideas. In the silence between steps, in the clues no one else saw. Poirot spent the rest of the morning in thought. Felicity Grey joined him later, drenched from the rain and breathless from the underground. They left it here? She asked in astonishment. Poirot nodded. Bold, is it not, to intrude upon my peace with such theatricality? Do you think it's someone from the tournament? I mean, someone else we overlooked? Poirot didn't answer immediately. He turned the travel chessboard toward her. Tell me, Mademoiselle Grey, does this position strike you as familiar? She studied the layout. It's similar to a problem Adrian posed once. Back in 2018, I think. He published it in Esprit Échec, the journal. Oui, Poirot said. I recall it. But in that problem, the white bishop was the key piece, not the rook. Which means this is not a repetition. It is a distortion. Felicity's brow furrowed. Someone is manipulating his old problems, rewriting them, twisting his strategies. To send a message? Poirot nodded. Or a challenge. You see, mademoiselle, Adrien Dubois lived not only for victory, but for legacy, for mystique, and someone, perhaps a former student or rival, believes there is unfinished business in his record. She leaned back, unsettled. But why involve you? Poirot smiled thinly. Because to make a grand statement, one must attract an audience, and I, it appears, have been selected as the final witness. A silence fell between them, punctuated only by the rain and the quiet clicking of cutlery. Then Poirot reached into his pocket and retrieved the typed note. The Queen's ghost is watching, he read aloud. They refer, of course, to Elodie, or at least the absence she left behind. Her silence has become a symbol. Felicity looked out the window. She hasn't responded to any of my messages. I've tried calling, even writing. Poirot's gaze drifted to the blurred shape of pedestrians through the rain. She is hiding, not from guilt, but from something else. From the unfinished part of this story. He folded the note again, then rose. I must consult an old archivist, she said. There is a record of Adrian's correspondence with a certain Anatole Marchand, a player exiled from the Parisian chess circles in the 1980s, a man who knew the darker strategies Dubois once flirted with. The timing fits, and if he is still alive, he may be the key. Felicity followed him out onto the street, the drizzle wetting her shoulders. Where do we find him? Poirot smiled beneath his umbrella. In Paris, of course, among the pieces long fallen off the board. Chapter 16. The Exile of Anatole Marchand. The streets of Paris had long ago shed the romanticism of postcards and perfumes for Hercule Poirot. He knew them intimately, not just their names and architecture, but their secrets. This city whispered when others shouted, and on this crisp grey morning, as the Seine sluggishly curved past shuttered cafes and quiet alleyways, it whispered one name louder than the rest: Marchand. Anatole Marchand had once been a name in whispered circles, an enfant terrible of French chess during the 1980s, a brilliant tactician who played without morality. In the age of Adrien Dubois' rising popularity, Marchand had been his dark mirror. While Dubois played for elegance, Marchand played to obliterate. His victories were brutal, and then, without warning, he vanished. Now Poirot stood at the top floor of a dim apartment building in the Marais, eyeing a rusted iron door with a peeling chessboard decal pasted to its frame. "He still lives here?" Felicity Gray asked softly beside him, clutching her coat. Poirot raised a gloved hand and knocked gently. The door creaked open with no sound of footsteps. In the doorway stood a tall man, gaunt and weathered, his thin grey hair falling around sharp cheekbones. His eyes, small, intense, and unblinking, fixed on Poirot immediately. "You," he said. "Oui," Poirot responded, bowing slightly. "Hercule Poirot." Marchand stood aside, wordlessly, allowing them in. The apartment was sparse, books stacked on every surface, many of them in Russian, some in Arabic. A chessboard sat under a cracked window, its pieces in mid-play. The room smelled of ink, tobacco, and long-forgotten plans. "I knew Adrien was dead before it was public," Marchand said, sitting heavily on a creaking armchair. "You can tell in the wind when a king falls. The board tilts." Poirot nodded, remaining standing. "Then you will not be surprised that I come to speak of his death." Marchand smirked. "No, but you'll not get a confession from me, monsieur." "I did not come for one." Marchand's fingers drummed the chair's arm. "Then speak." Poirot opened his coat, withdrawing a folded printout of the position from the travel chessboard. He placed it on the table between them. "This was left for me in London, a mimicry of one of Dubois' lesser-known compositions, though with key changes." Marchand glanced at the board, then smiled bitterly. The Queen's ghost problem, a cruel puzzle. Adrien designed it after Elodie's first disappearance, before she returned to him. It was never published officially. Poirot's brows lifted. "How do you know that?" "Because he sent it to me," Marchand said, his voice flat. "A taunt. He said it was the only problem that ever beat him, not because of its logic, but because of its pain." Felicity shifted uncomfortably. Poirot said, "You kept the letter." "I burned it," Marchand said, "as one does with insults, but the problem stayed in my mind." There was a long silence. Poirot then asked, "Did you ever meet Elodie Duras?" Marchand's eyes twitched. "Once, in 1992, Adrien brought her to a symposium in Lyon. She was very quiet, but sharp. She saw through the pretenses of men. I think Adrien admired her because she could destroy his illusions." Poirot slowly walked around the small room, eyes scanning the shelves. He stopped at a box labeled Correspondence, 1990-2000. "May I?" he asked. Marchand waved a hand. Inside were dozens of letters, some from players long since retired, others from tournament organizers, a few addressed in Adrien Dubois' bold script. Poirot carefully removed a small stack and flipped through them. Then he found it, a folded note tucked inside an envelope without postage, typed, just like the one left at Café Etude. He read it aloud. "You once claimed Adrien feared losing, but he feared her more. The queen waits for her revenge in silence. Perhaps this time, the sacrifice will be enough. Marchand shrugged. That arrived a month before Adrian died. I assumed it was some crank. Poirot did not share the assumption. He folded the letter and tucked it carefully into his notebook. There is a pattern, he said slowly. Someone is orchestrating a sequence, not just of riddles and board positions, but of revenge, of unfinished games. Felicity looked between the two men. But who? Poirot did not answer her. Instead, he looked to Marchand. In all your years of bitter rivalry, did Adrian ever mention a student, a protégé, someone outside the official circuits? Marchand's brow furrowed. He rubbed his chin, eyes narrowing in memory. There was one. Not a player, not exactly. A composer of problems, used to send Adrian these elaborate challenges in private. Went by the pseudonym Vierge Noire, Black Virgin, gender unknown. The problems were baroque, grotesque even. Adrian stopped answering them after one composition ended with the king captured. It enraged him. Poirot nodded, lips tight. Do you have any of them? No, Marchand said. But Adrian might have. If anyone would have kept the madness of others, it was him. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Then perhaps it is time we revisit Adrian's home. Officially. Felicity's mouth opened. But it's sealed. The estate is under lock since his death. But not to me, Poirot said. I'm not merely a guest in this mystery now, Mademoiselle Gray. I am its final player. Chapter 17. The House of Dubois. The estate of Adrien Dubois stood silent behind black wrought iron gates on the outskirts of Fontainebleau. Grand yet neglected, as though the chess master had grown weary of its opulence long before his death. The house, a two-story manor wrapped in dormant ivy, had a facade like a frozen yawn, wide, cold, and tired of waiting. Poirot stepped out of the hired car, his shoes crunching gravel beneath, and observed the grounds with a gaze sharpened by purpose. Felicity Gray followed him, hesitant, casting glances toward the shuttered windows like they might blink. It's unsettling, she said softly. Like the whole house is watching. Poirot nodded. It is not paranoia, mademoiselle. A home like this does watch, especially when it has been arranged by the mind of a strategist. A local notaire had granted Poirot temporary access. The authorities had completed their forensic sweep weeks ago, but Poirot had no interest in bloodstains or forensics. He was here for the board beneath the board, the game Dubois had been playing before he died. Inside, the house exhaled stale air as they entered. Dust danced in shafts of afternoon light that cut through narrow gaps in the curtains. The air smelled of paper, dry wood, and faded ink. In the foyer, portraits of long-dead chess champions stared down like saints in a shrine. Felicity moved toward the study door. The police said this was where Adrien spent most of his time, especially toward the end. Poirot opened the door, revealing a space both ornate and monastic. Tall bookshelves lined the walls, groaning under the weight of bound journals and obscure chess theory. At the center sat a long mahogany desk, and beside it, just as Felicity had described in London, stood a small table with an inlaid chessboard covered by a velvet cloth. Poirot approached it slowly and removed the cloth with quiet reverence. The position was identical to the one they'd seen in the photograph. He leaned closer. It is not simply a puzzle. It is a message, a final act of expression. Mademoiselle, observe. Felicity stepped nearer, squinting at the pieces. The white queen is missing, she said, replaced by a pawn that's advanced too far. Indeed, said Poirot. It is an unnatural sacrifice. The queen has been removed by choice. Felicity looked confused. What does that mean? Poirot tapped the table lightly. In chess, One sacrifices for advantage. But this is a symbolic resignation, a surrender. The Queen has stepped aside, allowing the board to collapse. He turned toward the desk and began opening drawers. It was the third drawer, locked with a simple mechanism that yielded what Poirot sought, a leather-bound folio labeled Correspondance, Vierge Noire. He opened it slowly. Dozens of typed letters were bound within, each one postmarked from different European cities, Venice, Tallinn, Prague, all unsigned, all addressing Dubois in the same cold, deliberate tone. Your victories are built on silence. You stole from the grave and called it brilliance. But she remembers Adrian. One day you will face her again. Not over the board, but beneath it. The final move will not be yours. Felicity read over his shoulder, her face draining of color. These are threats. Poirot nodded. But not ordinary ones. They are authored by someone who knew him intimately. Not only his games, but his guilt. He turned the final page. Tucked within was a diagram, a new chess composition. The Queen was placed back on the board, but the King was now surrounded, unable to move. Checkmate. Poirot stared at it for a long moment. This, he said softly, is the last message. Not from Dubois, but to him. It was sent shortly before his death. Felicity whispered, "Who is Vierge Noire?" Poirot's gaze was far away. "That is what we must discover. But I suspect now that we are not seeking a player. We are seeking a ghost, one born of betrayal, injustice, and an unfinished game." He folded the diagram and placed it into his pocket. "Come, mademoiselle. The final match awaits us, but not on this board. We must speak with someone who has been haunting the periphery for too long." "Who?" Poirot adjusted his tie. "Elodie Duras." Final chapter. Checkmate in silence. Elodie Duras had aged like the sea in winter, weathered, grey and mournful beneath stillness. She welcomed Poirot into her modest apartment on the Rue des Écoles with polite reserve, dressed in muted tones, her movements deliberate. Her voice, when it came, was soft, almost frail. "I didn't expect you to come, Monsieur Poirot," she said. Offering tea, he politely declined. The others, they stopped caring long ago. Poirot studied her for a moment. In her eyes, there was neither guilt nor innocence, only weariness. "It is not apathy I found in the others," Poirot replied gently. "It is fear. But you are different, madame." She gave a hollow smile. "Because I have nothing left to lose?" "No," Poirot said quietly. "Because you once lost everything and then chose silence." She blinked, hands tightening around the edge of her shawl. "You're here about Adrian?" Poirot nodded. "And about the girl. Sophie." A pause. A tremor passed through Elodie's jaw. "No one ever says her name anymore." "But he did," Poirot said, withdrawing the letter he had found in the Dubois estate. "Again and again in secret, in fear, in guilt." He laid the final chess diagram on her kitchen table. Her breath caught. She touched it as if unsure it was real. "It was Sophie's final composition," she said softly, voice cracking. "He copied it." "Yes, and published it as his own, the crown of his career. He let her disappear into obscurity, even in death." "She wasn't supposed to be in that tournament," Elodie whispered. "She was only 17. A prodigy, yes, but too young. Adrian brought her in as a favor to me, but he hated being bested." Poirot leaned forward. "You believe he sabotaged her?" Elodie met his eyes. "I know he did. He manipulated the board during their match. A minor switch in notation, unseen by the adjudicators. She spotted it later. She confronted him. And then," Poirot said quietly, "she vanished. She fell from the hotel's west terrace, the night after the final match. Felicity, silent until now, gasped. But everyone thought it was an accident. There was no investigation, Elodie said bitterly. Just a footnote in tournament records. Poirot folded his hands. And you let him live. Why? Elodie's voice trembled. Because vengeance would not bring her back. And I thought, if I haunted him long enough with guilt, it would break him. Poirot looked toward the window. It did. Silence fell over the room, heavy and sad. Felicity finally spoke. So Vierge Noire, was you? Elodie nodded. Her chess handle. Black Maiden. I used it to send him letters, reminders, of what he stole, of who she was. Poirot stood slowly. It was a psychological checkmate, madame, and in the end, he resigned. Elodie's eyes shimmered. He could never recreate another masterpiece, not without her. Poirot turned, his voice now tinged with finality. And yet this is not justice. She met his gaze squarely. No, but it is the only truth left. 2 weeks later, London, the Queen's Gambit Club. The scandal had broken across European newspapers. Adrien Dubois' final composition was revealed to be plagiarized from an obscure, unpublished work by a young girl named Sophie Duras. Her story became legend overnight. The silenced prodigy, the stolen legacy. The Octagonal chess tournament dissolved in disgrace. Sponsors withdrew, trophies were recalled, and the chair of the committee resigned. In the library of the Queen's Gambit Club, Poirot and Felicity sat across from one another, the board between them untouched. I still can't decide if Elodie was right, Felicity murmured. She didn't kill him, but she let him die. Poirot regarded her carefully. Sometimes, mademoiselle, the death of the soul precedes the death of the body. Adrien Dubois murdered with silence. Elodie returned the silence to him, compounded and unrelenting. Felicity looked down at the board. You never made your move. Poirot smiled gently. Because this time the game is finished, she sighed. It's tragic, really. A tournament built on brilliance, undone by a single stolen move. Poirot shook his head slowly. Non, mademoiselle. It was not the move that unraveled everything. It was the forgetting of a girl, of truth, of honor. He stood and offered her his hand. Come, we shall leave this place. No more ghosts on the board today. As they exited, the chessboard remained behind them, empty now, the pieces reset. The game, at last, was over.